The coffee smelled wrong the instant it touched the air, like nickels pressed to the back of my tongue like a thunderstorm in a metal mug. James leaned closer with the kind of smile that shows teeth, but not trust. "I made this one just for you," he said. And beside him, his sister stirred her own untouched cup as if she were pretending not to watch. We were at her glass-topped dining table, the one that always reflected us upside down, and I thought, this is the first honest mirror in this house. I am 31 years old, a woman who grew up on the noisy side of a small Tennessee town and fought her way into a city corner office. I married into this family of silent hallways and soft-voiced orders 3 years ago, and I have learned the rules: smile with your lips, not your eyes. Speak in questions when you mean no. Pretend you don't notice when the floor tilts. Today the floor tilted like a trap door. I cupped the mug the way I do a fragile secret, just enough pressure to feel it pulse. My mother taught me to always taste the air first, to wait 1 second longer than polite before swallowing anything someone else prepared. She said it after layoffs we didn't deserve, after breakups that sounded like apologies, after church gossip disguised as prayer. She didn't live long enough to see me marry James. She didn't see me carry my ambition like a lantern into their family's carefully darkened rooms. Maybe she would have told me to trust my first flinch. The metallic note scraped something old inside me, the memory of all those accidents that kept happening around my plate: too much nutmeg, not enough care, a tea that made my hands shake, a breakfast that put me in urgent care. The doctors were puzzled, the explanations were reasonable, the pattern was unmistakable. Every time I grew a little louder, they turned the music up. Nina's house was a careful kind of beautiful that never let me forget it. Coasters already under my glass, napkins already folded. My chair tugged just an inch closer to the table than comfort allows. Nina was 34, going on queen with manicured control, and a laugh pitched to make people lean in. She didn't dislike me so much as dislike what I represented, proof that proximity to their family name was not the only currency in the room. She worked across town at a rival firm, and if we weren't tied by marriage, we would have been tied anyway, by the way her eyes narrowed whenever my name came up. James said I was imagining it. James said families are messy. James said stop keeping score. But my body kept the score for me, one ER visit at a time. I lifted the mug and let the heat fog my glasses. "It smells bold," I said gently. James shrugged, casual to the point of performance. Nina's spoon clicked against porcelain, a metronome I recognized from a dozen compelled brunches, the rhythm of her patience. I studied the surface of the coffee. There is a stillness that feels like silence, and a stillness that feels like stalking. This was the second kind. In my lap, my phone thrummed an email from a client with a subject line I'd been waiting on for months: Henderson. I felt my pulse pick up. The last time I'd been unexpectedly sick was the morning I was scheduled to present to Henderson. Nina had shown up with a little gift box, throat lozenges, and tea. "Soothe your voice," she'd said, her eye contact too steady to be kindness. Later, my voice shook for other reasons. "Would you mind if I take a quick call?" I asked, already pushing my chair back. "Work on a Sunday?" Nina tilted her head. Sweetness sharpened to a point. "That account must be important." "It is." I smiled in a way that told them nothing. "I'll be quick." I walked toward the study. Halfway there, the edge of the rug lifted and I stumbled, an inelegant little skid, my hands splaying the cups, clinking as the table jostled. "God, I'm such a klutz," I said, laughing at myself so they wouldn't. James rose, a chivalrous reflex that came half a second too late. Nina's hand went to her cup. Mine did too. The world rotated one notch, and when it settled, the mugs had traded places as if they'd planned it together. In the quiet of the study doorway, I lifted my phone and turned on the camera. I didn't start recording yet, I just watched the screen's mirror the way a lifeguard watches a still pool scanning for a ripple. The house hum rose and fell. Far down the hall, a grandfather clock squared its shoulders for the next chime. I could see them framed by the doorway's trim, Nina's fingers against white porcelain, James's jaw working like a man trying to chew an explanation he will have to swallow. My hands trembled not with fear, but with something older. There's a rage that isn't loud, it's patient. It keeps records. It smells the metal before it tastes the burn. For months I'd been collecting the subtle wrongs that looked right if you blinked. In another life I might have been a librarian. In this one I filed evidence under survival. Nina raised the mug. 20 seconds can feel like a lifetime when you might be a widow at the end of it. I wanted to say her name. I wanted to reach across the room and slap the cup away to stop the scene before it made itself permanent. But there are truths you can only hold if you let them happen. I watched the first sip touch her mouth, watched the calculation in her face go briefly, beautifully blank. James didn't breathe. Another sip. A pause. A blink, like someone trying to read small print in a lightning storm. I remembered the night months ago when I found a locked drawer in our bedroom and opened it with an old bobby pin, surprised by my own competence and my own audacity. Inside was a thin folder printouts of my calendar. A note in James's slanted hand. H prefers her, and tucked at the back a photograph of the Anderson siblings, younger by a decade, standing with a woman whose face I recognized from an obituary. I didn't understand then why the image made my stomach drop. I thought it was grief. Now as Nina's hand began to tremble, I understood that grief is only one name for a missing piece. There were other names, inheritance leverage proof. Nina set the mug down too carefully. The spoon's handle rang against the rim. She pressed her lips together as though holding back a complaint. James leaned in. His voice when it came was thin. "You took the wrong." He stopped the rest of the sentence, withering in the air between them. My thumb found the record button. The red dot bloomed like a warning light. James reached for the mug as if touching it could rewind the last 10 seconds and stitch the moment back together with invisible thread. "You took the wrong," he'd started, and then he shut his mouth like he'd trapped a confession between his teeth. I could smell the panic before I saw it. It has a scent, you know, like the air inside an elevator that stops between floors. Nina's hand fluttered to her throat and then stilled. She looked at her brother. Not me, as if I were just a window reflecting back the weather. "It tastes off," she said finally, attempting a laugh that didn't have the energy to climb her throat. Maybe the beans were old. She pushed the cup away with 2 fingers. It left a ring on the glass table, a small dark eclipse. I stared at it the way you stare at an X-ray and realize you've been living with a fracture you cannot see. "Let me make us new ones," James said, already moving too helpful too fast toward the kitchen. His chair skated backwards with a squeal that made me think of a trapped animal. I stayed where I was, the camera lens a patient eye in my palm. There's a kind of mercy in silence. It lets people tell on themselves. Nina wiped the ring with a napkin like it disgusted her, then folded the napkin into a neat, diminishing square. When her gaze slid to me, I could see that she was trying to decide which version of me would be easiest to manage: the naive wife who forgives the hysterical woman who gets dismissed, or the cold professional who never raises her voice until it matters. I lifted my eyebrows, polite as a closed door. We listened to the sweater-soft sounds of the kitchen cabinet doors, breathing open and shut, water running, metal tapping metal. The grandfather clock counted our heartbeats. I thought of my mother again, of the last time I made her coffee in the nurse's lounge 2 nights before she died. She'd smiled through the cannula and said I'd always been good at noticing the thing nobody notices. "You see the corners of the picture," she'd whispered. "Corners are where the truth hides." I was 24 and thought grief was something you outrun. I didn't know that grief builds a house inside you and pays the rent on time. James reappeared with a different pot and 3 new mugs, all plain white, all suddenly suspicious. He set mine down like a peace offering, and Nina's like a dare. "Fresh," he announced. He didn't meet my eyes. He was handsome the way a good apology is convincing, until you realize it doesn't change the fact. I took 1 small sip, a theater of trust. It tasted like nothing but coffee. Nina mirrored me, and I watched her shoulders loosen half an inch as relief took root and tried to grow. I have a call at 3, I said, checking my phone, though I already knew. With Henderson, the final review. The word landed with the weight of a verdict. James blinked. Nina didn't. Her mouth smiled while her pupils didn't move. You must be excited, she chirped. We all want this to go well. All. The word was a net she wanted to throw over me and drag me into their collective. I nodded like a person who didn't know they'd been measured and found inconvenient. What happened the morning I was supposed to meet Henderson last month? I asked conversationally. When I couldn't stop shaking, James's jaw did that thing again, grinding the air into chewable excuses. You had a bug, he said. Everyone at the office had it. Nina dabbed at a non-existent crumb. I brought you tea, she added, like generosity were an alibi. You're welcome. I never said thank you, I replied. I should do that now. I let the sentence be a glass I placed between us to see who would flinch at their reflection. Nina's eyes flicked to the study doorway, then to the cup she'd abandoned. Her hand, those perfect nails, drifted, then retreated. In the hallway, a cool draft moved through the house. Somewhere upstairs, a door eased against its frame with the softest thud. The house was listening. I thought about that locked drawer again, about the thin folder and the photograph James and Nina as kids, standing between a father who looked like a man who preferred arches to doorways, and a woman with kind, tired eyes. The obituary had named her as their aunt, but the way the children leaned in, the way she held their shoulders, the way my mother used to hold mine. No aunt. Something buried had a heartbeat. And behind the folder, that note in James's hand, H prefers her. I had assumed Henderson. A compliment to pocket like a charm. But now in the kitchen, air gone too still. I heard a second meaning, H, as in Helen. The name under the photo, the woman they called aunt. The woman I now suspected was the wrong word for mother. Prefers her, prefers me. Why would a dead woman prefer me? Do you remember Helen? I asked, my voice almost gentle. James's head snapped up an instinct, not a choice. Nina's face closed like a fist. Our aunt, she said too quickly, died when we were kids. She reached for the napkin again, then stopped as if she'd realized there was nothing left to fold. I held her gaze until her eyelashes fluttered like she wanted to blink me away. She kept a safety deposit box, I said, hearing myself say it only as I realized I believed it. People like Helen do. They save what the house won't hold. The truth arrived in my mouth whole without the usual need to chew. Corners of the picture. I saw the way James's shoulders sagged like a man who's been carrying two lies at once and finally lets one touch the floor. Why would you think that he asked, trying for innocence and landing on exhaustion? I set my phone down, screen still lit. The red dot felt like a witness with a perfect memory. Because I looked in your drawer, I said. Because I can smell intent. I glanced at Nina's first cup and then at the new one. Because I know the difference between a mistake and a plan. Nina stood. The chair legs squealed again, an animal trying to flee. You're being dramatic, she announced. If you think we'd hurt you. The sentence trailed off limp in the air. I didn't move. I don't think I said softly. I notice. And then I told them, like you tell a story to a child who refuses to sleep, the times the food tasted wrong, the way the accidents circled my calendar like vultures, the night I sat in our bathroom and pressed my fingers into my wrists until the room stopped spinning. I watched the color drain from Nina's face first, then return in twin spots of anger. James went quiet in that way that means a dam is deciding whether to break. Say what you're afraid to say, I whispered. Because if you don't, I will. James looked like a man standing on a frozen lake hearing the first crack. His mouth opened and closed once, twice, and then the words came out like he was spitting out a pebble he'd been hiding under his tongue. It wasn't poison, he said. It was just something to take the edge off. He flinched at his own sentence. A tiny dose. You've been so keyed up. We needed you calm. There are sentences that try to make a cage sound like a cradle. I have learned to hear their hinge. Nina's face didn't soften. She watched me with that bright, brittle attention I'd seen on women who are 1 second away from shattering a glass with their bare hands. A beta blocker, she added, voice light as dust. Barely anything. We didn't want you missing the call again, only slower, softer. Less you. The smile that came with it had edges. I thought of all the days my heart had thudded like an argument in my chest, how I'd blamed anxiety, blamed my body's old habit of bracing for impact. The body keeps its own calendar marks anniversaries of harm, whether or not we send invitations. I felt the floor tilt again. This time I steadied myself before the trapdoor could swing. You put something in my cup today, I said. It wasn't a question. James's eyes darted to Nina, a boy checking with his older sister, if he's allowed to tell the truth. She lifted one shoulder, a shrug that meant don't be weak. We couldn't let you walk into Henderson with that energy, she said lower now, like confiding. H prefers you. We know. We saw the emails. We were trying to protect the family from a mistake you'd make with your ambition. She made ambition sound like a rash you scratch until you bleed. The note in James's drawer. H prefers her. I had been flattered. I had not understood how flattery can grow teeth in the wrong mouths. Not poison, I repeated, tasting the word until it gave up its costume. Then you won't mind a talk screen. I raised the phone and let the little red dots stare at them. Because if there's nothing in that first cup, you'll be fine. If there is, we'll have names for it. Nina's throat jumped. She glanced at the abandoned mug, then at the new one, calculating what could be diluted by performance. You wouldn't, she said. You wouldn't drag us through that. The US was a rope she picked up and tried to pull me over a line with. There is no us, I said, not unkindly. There's what was done and there's what happens next. James sank into his chair like it had grown a spine he could borrow. I told her no. He whispered the confession, spilling at last. I told her we could just wait until the Henderson thing passed. I thought... He scrubbed his hands over his face. I thought you'd be grateful. You're always so wound. I thought maybe... He didn't finish because the grandfather clock began to toll the hour and the sound cut his apology into even pieces. When the last chime dissolved, Nina laughed, an ugly sound that didn't belong in her curated house. Grateful, she echoed. For being handled, for being muted, like a TV when the men are talking. She looked at me, and there it was, finally the undressed feeling I'd seen hiding in her eyes every holiday, every shared meal, not just rivalry, but fear. You don't belong here, she hissed. You make us look small. I let the words sit between us until their heat faded and only shape was left. What happened to Helen? I asked. The question landed like a dropped ring on tile. James inhaled sharp. Nina froze so completely I could hear the refrigerator hum, arguing with the silence. Our aunt died, she recited, a schoolchild, when we were kids. The script had been memorized so long her mouth moved on its own. The rest of her face had not gotten the message. Your mother, I said softly. You mean your mother, the one in the photo in your drawer, the one whose obituary I found, the one who got sick until she didn't get to be anything anymore. James pressed his fingers into his lids like he could rub away a picture. When he dropped his hands, he looked like a man who had been trying to be a good son in a house built for a different kind of loyalty. Dad made us say, Aunt, he said, a breath of betrayal. He said the papers would make it messy and messy would make us weak. Nina's anger flared hot enough to light the room. He held this family together, she snapped. You don't know what it took. You don't know what it means to choose order over chaos. The last word broke on her tongue. I thought of the metallic scent again, that coin-flavored warning. Did Helen die slowly? I asked. Did the air taste like pennies at the end? For a moment, just a heartbeat, Nina's gaze lost its armor, and I saw a child in a hallway, smelling something she cannot name, and learning that this is what love does. It keeps you alive as long as you behave. Her mouth wobbled, then set. She was sick, she repeated. She was sick, and then she died, and Dad took care of us. You learned to take care of people too, I said. You learned how to soften them until they stop arguing. You learned the dose that doesn't look like a crime. My voice stayed gentle, because somebody in this room needed to know that truth can be said without becoming a weapon. I switched the mugs I added. Both of them jerked, then went very still. In the glass table's reflection, I saw the scene twice, our real faces and our upside-down ones both telling the same story. I didn't want to die to prove my point, I said. I wanted you to hear the sound your own fear makes when it's in your mouth. Nina's hand went to her stomach like she'd been struck, though she was upright and unmarked. She stopped, swallowed, shook her head. There wasn't enough. James rushed the reflexive comfort, the guilty give, the guilty. There wasn't enough. The sentence tried to be mercy and failed. I stood the phone steady in my palm. We're going to the ER, I said. You'll tell them exactly what you put in that cup. You'll tell them when the knot poison started and in what and why. And after they draw blood, I'm going to ask you a second question about Helen, and this time you'll answer it like she's in the room. For a long breath, no one moved. Then Nina did something I didn't expect. Her fingers, so practiced at neatness, fumbled toward the framed photograph propped on the bookshelf by the window. The one of 2 children and a woman with kind, tired eyes standing in front of a bank I now recognized from a plaque Fidelity in Henderson. She lifted the frame like a lifeline and turned it over. The backing was worn where a thumb had worried it 100 times. She pried it up and a small brass key slid into her palm. It made the softest sound when it fell onto the glass table like a bell heard 2 rooms away. Corners, she whispered, not looking at me. She always told us the truth lives in the corners. She closed her eyes. Box 314. Downtown. I never went. When she opened them again, they were wet and furious. You make us look small, she said, voice wrecked. Because you see what we never let ourselves see. My rage, which had been pacing the perimeter of my ribs, sat down beside my grief and looked at Nina without gloating. Come with us, I said. To the hospital, then to the bank. Let's stop letting dead people do all the honesty. James nodded too quickly, a man drowning who sees a shore and doesn't care if it's made of rock. Nina stared at the key like it might bloom teeth. Then she set it carefully between us as if choosing where to put the beginning. The ER waiting room had the kind of light that forgives nothing blue-white and clinical a sky, with all the warmth vacuumed out. I sat with my hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup of water and watched Nina sign her name in a shaking script that tried to pretend it wasn't afraid. James kept touching the back of his neck like he was checking for a tag he couldn't tear off. The nurse asked careful questions in a voice that had seen worse than our little family drama and still made room for it. Non-prescribed ingestion, she wrote, and I watched the words as if they were being carved into the table we'd used for Sunday dinners. When the blood draw was done and the monitors hummed their calm machine lullaby, a physician told us we'd have preliminary results quickly, and the rest later. Looks like a low dose of a beta blocker, she said, eyes moving evenly between Nina and me. Not lethal, but absolutely not nothing. There are sentences that sound like a bridge and end up being a line you can't uncross. This was one. I stepped into the hallway to breathe air that didn't remember our names. The clock on the wall read 2:57. Henderson at 3, still true, still impossible. There are days when your life insists on happening all at once, and you have to decide which fire to tend first. I stared at my phone and saw my mother's hand over mine in the nurse's lounge years ago. Corners, she'd said. Start with the corners. I found an alcove near a window that looked out over the parking lot's glittering scatter of windshields and dialed in. When the conference line clicked alive, I could hear the soft shuffle of a team assembling, a throat cleared. A keyboard quieted the little silence that means a decision is about to put on its coat. I spoke the way you speak when you know there's no second chance, not with them and not with yourself. I did not sound like a woman in a hospital. I sounded like a woman who had built a house inside herself, where the lights worked even when the power failed. I walked them through our plan the way a pianist walks a melody back to the first note, and shows you it was inevitable all along. When I finished, the quiet on the line shifted from measuring to considering. A voice I hadn't expected, older grain smooth, asked two precise questions that hit the corners of the picture like thumbtacks. I answered. Another pause, this one kind. We go with you, the voice said. Email the revised deck. The line clicked and the hospital air came back full of other people's stories trying to get born and end at the same time. I let my head touch the glass and closed my eyes. The relief wasn't joy. It was scaffolding. It would hold until it didn't have to. Back in the room, Nina looked small against the rectangle of the bed. She wasn't made for fluorescent light. She lifted her eyes when I entered, and something in them surprised me. Not resentment, not yet apology, but a recognition that we were standing on opposite shores of the same river, and it had started to rise. Positive for beta blocker, the doctor confirmed. We'll file the report, and you can go. The report hung between us like a new piece of furniture we'd all have to walk around now. James asked to speak to me alone, but I didn't leave Nina's line of sight, and he understood. I'm sorry, he said, and the words fell heavy and incomplete. He looked like a boy who had wanted the water to be still and had learned that his wanting wasn't big enough to hold the wind. Sorry is a beginning, I said. It isn't the story. We left with a paper wristband sliding loose on Nina's arm and the brass key warm in her pocket like a small animal. The bank was closed to civilians on Sundays, but grief and money share a back door. Nina called the number on a faded card tucked behind the photograph's frame, and the woman who answered had the same grain-smooth voice I'd heard on the call. Henderson, not the account, the person. Harriet Henderson, who had once backed Helen's mortgage when she shouldn't have, and had never regretted it. If you have box 314's key, Harriet said, you have what you need. I'll meet you there. The vault smelled like old envelopes and air that had practiced keeping confidences. The metal boxes ran in tidy rows like apartments for things people couldn't hold in daylight. Nina's hand shook as she slid the key in. I had the thought that keys are just questions with metal spines. The door of 314 opened with a soft, disloyal sigh. Inside, a manila folder sat on top like a patient pulled to the front of the line. Nina lifted it and passed it to me, as if it weighed more than her arm could bear. Beneath the folder, other small, careful lives, an 8x10 photograph in a sealed sleeve, a thumb drive taped to a letter, a ring in a cloth pouch that had been turned and turned until the fabric thinned. We all three, me, Nina, Harriet, stood around the narrow table covered in green felt as if at a wake. I opened the letter. The paper had the faint roughness of something kept safe by fear and by love. Helen's handwriting looked like a woman who apologized for taking up a line and then decided not to. If you are reading this, it began then the house finally spoke, or the house finally broke. She did not use the words we all carry like knives, abuse, poison, control. She didn't have to. She described mornings with a coin taste in her mouth, afternoons that blurred evenings that ended before the sun did. She named the rules of the house and the way children learn to breathe around rules until they think air belongs to them only if they're still. She said she had made copies, kept receipts, written down dates and doses the way women write down recipes. She had saved hair in a ribboned envelope in case the heir ever had to be proven, and she had given a backup set to a friend behind a desk at a bank who believed that order should serve people, not the other way around. If you are not my children opening this, she wrote, then perhaps a woman like I was has finally seen the corners and chosen to turn on a light. The thumb drive held scans, journals with careful notations, images of lab results with numbers underlined, a photo of a bruise shaped like a thumbprint on a wrist. I suddenly recognized as the same wrist that had poured me tea in a memory Nina now couldn't stand in. A notarized affidavit named the father and asked that should certain conditions arise, the contents be given to the district attorney, or if the children chose, to my friend H, who prefers women who notice what others don't. H prefers her. The note in James's drawer widened into meaning until I could have fallen through it. Henderson had meant Harriet once, and lately it had meant an account that was watching me watch it. corners everywhere. Nina pressed her palm to the table as if bracing herself against a wave. James had gone almost gray. He said she was weak, Nina whispered. He said the doctor got it wrong. She looked up at me like I had the authority to unwrite a childhood. What do we do? She asked, though we finally becoming a real place to stand. I kept my voice steady, because somebody's had to be. We tell the truth, I said. We go to the police with the ER report and this box. We let Harriet help us. And then we let what happens next happen, not because we want revenge to have a name, but because we want the house to stop being dangerous. Harriet nodded once, her mouth a weathered line that had learned what storms do to trees. The truth is slow until it isn't, she said. Make copies. Keep the originals with me. She touched the folder like a benediction. Then go home and pack what you need. In the elevator up from the vault, I looked at my reflection in the goldish mirror and saw a woman whose shoulders had shifted forward the way people lean into wind. I was not triumphant. I was something quieter and more permanent. The door slid open. The afternoon had tilted into evening. The sky over the empty parking lot had the bruised color of healing. Nina held the key between her fingers like a narrow question. I thought of Helen's letter, of my mother's whisper, of James's apology. That would have to become a practice if it wanted to be anything at all. I didn't know yet which ending we were walking toward, satisfying, heartbreaking, or the kind that feels like both, because the truth rarely chooses a single weather. But the road out of the house had finally appeared, and this time I had witnesses. We packed like people leaving a country, not a house. The light had gone soft, the kind that makes everything look truer and more temporary. Nina moved through her rooms with a care I hadn't seen when she was arranging napkins. She chose documents, the photo in its new sleeve, a sweater that still smelled like a better day. James folded and refolded clothes as if neatness could be a bridge back to the world he wanted. I took what I had always owned, my laptop, the thumb drive's copy, the habit of noticing. On the way out, Nina paused in the foyer and looked up at the chandelier that had overseen so many dinners where silence was the main course. We ate under this, she said quietly, not accusing anyone except the ceiling. She locked the door, and something old in the house sighed with relief that did not belong to it. Harriet's friend of the precinct met us at a side entrance. Paperwork is its own weather. It gathered around us, pages sliding over counters like a steady rain. We gave statements that made our own mouths sting, attached the ER report, cataloged the contents of box 314. When the detective asked if we wanted to be there when they served the warrant, I expected Nina to say no. She surprised me again. If the house is going to speak, she said, I want to hear it. Her voice wobbled, then held. I stood beside her because revenge, when it decides to be generous, is just honesty with witnesses. At her father's door, the detective knocked, and the house shivered. He opened it with his old authority, the kind that makes rooms sit up straighter without being told. Seeing the badge, he began to perform a man persecuted by strangers. Seeing James and Nina, he tried for father. Seeing me, he reached for the tone he kept for women who wouldn't stay small. He started with the oldest trick: make the person who says this hurts explain their tone. Nina didn't give him that foothold. She held up the copy of Helen's letter the way a priest holds a relic and said, "We're done." His face changed in a way you can't rehearse, the skin rearranging around a truth that refuses to be decorative. The detective read the warrant. They walked him through his own living room and sat him in his own chair. It is a strange mercy to watch a house become neutral. The furniture stops taking sides when the law arrives. He denied what could still be denied and discredited what could not. He blamed Helen's constitution, the doctor's incompetence, the world's appetite for scandal. He called me the woman who infected his son with disobedience, and for the first time since the morning began, I let myself smile. "Sir," the detective said flatly, "your daughter tested positive for a drug you did not prescribe, and your late partner documented a pattern you cannot outrun." He asked a few questions with corners on them. The answers snagged. When they took him, the house didn't creak. It exhaled. After they left, the three of us stood in the threshold like survivors of a weather event, unsure whether to name it a hurricane or a clearing wind. Nina pressed her fingers to the doorframe and then let go. James sank onto the bottom stair and stared at his hands. "I thought loyalty meant keeping quiet," he said finally, using the right word like a man learning the name of his own breath. "I thought calm meant love." He looked up at me, eyes rimmed red. "I thought if you made less noise, we'd all be safe." He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was submitting his education for grading. "Noise saved us," I said. "Yours, mine." Helen's bound up in a box until we listened. I wanted to reach for him and I didn't. Some gestures belong to futures we haven't earned. The Henderson deal closed with a signature that felt like a small, meticulously built raft slipping into the water. In the days that followed, reporters called, lawyers called, distant cousins called to say they had always suspected. The precinct took custody of the originals. Harriet became a constant, a steadying tide. James moved into an apartment with soft, unambitious furniture. He checked in with me without asking for anything except a chance to do the next right thing. Sometimes that is the most you can ask of a person. Sometimes it is exactly enough. Nina returned to the glass-topped table, not to host but to write. I visited once and she showed me the first page of the book she didn't yet have the courage to name. The working title in the corner said, "Corners," and I pretended not to notice the way her hand trembled and still made each letter clear. I filed for separation with a pen that shook only once. There wasn't hatred in it. There was a clean ache, the kind you feel when a bone that healed wrong is finally reset. James and I walked one slow lap around a lake and said the sentences that cut us loose without cutting each other down. He thanked me for switching the cups. I thanked him for not defending the indefensible when the door opened and the law walked in. We didn't promise friendship. We promised to send each other old photographs if we found them in boxes we hadn't opened yet. Sometimes mercy is specific. On the first quiet night in my new place, I made coffee and let it cool until the steam stopped making little ghosts. I brought the cup to my nose and smelled only the ordinary bitterness that means morning is possible. I drank it beside the window and watched the city keep its promises. Buses arriving, dogs urging their people into motion, a girl on a bike balancing a bouquet of white flowers that looked like the idea of forgiveness. I thought of my mother telling me the truth lives in the corners of Helen, writing her life down, so that we would one day believe our own tongues, of Nina, pressing a key into my palm like an apology and a beginning. And I thought of the taste of metal that started all of this, and how sometimes survival requires you to swap the cup record, the silence call the hour, and walk toward a vault with a stranger who says your name like a vow. If there is a lesson I can give anyone who hears this, it is not glamorous. It is not revenge with fireworks. It is this: pay attention to what your body knows before your mind gives it permission. Honor the small alarm that rings when rooms demand you become smaller to fit. Loyalty without truth is just a prettier word for harm. Love that asks you to be quiet is love preparing to disappear you. Choose the door that leads you back to yourself. Even if it opens onto a hallway, you have to walk alone. The house will try to keep you. The house will fail. If this story met you where you needed it, if it made you braver about the corners, stay with me. Like this video so the algorithm doesn't hush it. Share it with someone learning to choose the louder kind of love. Subscribe if you want more true things told gently. And tell me in the comments the moment you first learned to trust your own warning light. I read them all because that's how we build a safer house together.